Okay, user stories and use cases. As I said, this is continuing a bit from the requirements engineering lecture, moving a bit further into the specification of requirements in the Agile community, that's user stories, and then moving back towards UML with use cases again. We'll be discussing why they are similar and why they are different, and how to work with them. Right, so user stories, they are their response to how regular requirements engineering and regular requirements documents can list pages upon pages upon requirements detailing the same thing, to a very elaborate detail, because they are the basis for signing a contract and so on, so they have to be complete and binding and everything. In the Agile community, it was recognized that this simply led to a lot of extra work. You specify the requirements just for the sake of being able to write a contract on them, but not to be able to deliver value and actually implement working software. So they went looking for a different way of doing things, ended up with user stories. They have a simpler structure. They are not worked with in the same way as as a regular requirement specification. I'll come back to that. So the template first for specifying a user story is that as a specific type of user, I want to achieve some goal with the system, so that, and then there's a reason to explain why I want this. And it was agreed upon that this is more or less sufficient for a developer to be able to figure out, what am I supposed to be doing? It's enough to be able to prioritize between different user stories. It's enough to get going with the implementation. It's enough to with a bit of imagination, come up with different solutions, weigh them against each other, and if you run into a problem, you can always find the type of user and talk more about them, about requirement with them. Rather than signing a contract and having payment schemes and all of those sorts of things based on the requirements, what you do in the Agile community is that you normally have a list of requirements. That's a living list that you add to, you remove from, and you work with that, separate from any payment, any billing, any time reporting or anything like that. So this is just, these are the requirements, and at the top is the most important requirement to start working on right now. And then in descending orders, requirements at the bottom, the user stories at the bottom, they are things that, yeah, they are not really important right now. They might be things that we'll be thinking about sometime in the future. They might be cool ideas that if we get to them, it'll be fun, but it's not something that we are focusing on right now. That means also that you have different levels of clarity. So the requirements that are at the top of this pile, they are clear and specific. They are detailed enough so that you can start working on them, whereas the user stories at the bottom of the pile, they can be vague. They can be very unspecified in some sense, like we want to enter the Chinese market or something like that. That can be in the bottom of the pile, because you're not going to use that requirement as a guide for implementation. You're going to use it as a guide for breaking it down and creating new user stories that detail what it actually means to go into the Chinese market, like support for pictograms, perhaps better picture, higher resolution, whatever else you want to have in the application in order to support the Chinese market. And those are actionable. Those will be higher up in the pile of requirements. Those are the things that you will be able to take. This is what we're working on right now. We're implementing support for pictograms in our software. These high-level user stories that describe these types of goals, they are often called epics. They are not longer, if you just look at the user story itself, it's the exact same template. As a type of user, I want to some goal, so that some reason. It's just that if you look at what does it mean to enter the Chinese market, it's much bigger. So it's not just a story, it's a whole epic. Even the requirements at the top of this pile, or user stories at the top of this pile, maybe aren't fully detailed yet either, because that's, you can have a bit of leeway to, when you start the sprint, you can hammer out the details even further. And by doing it like this, by doing these user stories, these goals instead, you give more freedom to the developers. So rather than having these 200 requirements on how to design a login window, the goal is that as the owner of this software, I want users to authenticate themselves so that I know they have access, they're allowed to do what they're supposed to do. Authentication can be done in many different ways. Doesn't have to be username, password, doesn't have to be something I type in. I can use two-factor authentication together with the phone. That's one way of doing it. I can use fingerprint scanners. I can use retinal scanners if you want. I can use pictures of my face, although that's a really crappy password, but that's another story. So all of those are solutions for authentication. And maybe I don't even need to do any of that. If the reason is that as the owner of the software, that when it's running, I want to see that people have the right to do what they're doing, maybe I can do that in different ways. Maybe they can have a code to enter in order to gain access to one specific feature. And if you have that code, you have the access right to do it. Maybe you can use one-off codes or something like that for that, for those parts of the software where it actually matters. And all of these are different ways of solving the same problem. But as a developer, I don't need to be told which to use already in the requirement specification with these 200 requirements, because I can look at the goal, I can look at the reason, and then I can come up with something that, yeah, this would work, this would satisfy the brief that I've got, and I can go to that type of user, and I can go to the contractors, the people paying for the software, and I can run that idea by them. I'm thinking of solving this in that way. Is this a good idea? And then they might come up with, say that, yeah, sure, that would work. Or they will say that, yeah, no, really, not really, because we have these other, and then you have other reasons as well. And then you can clarify that authentication has to be done in a particular way, but that's a second step. It shouldn't be the first step. This means that you can start working on the user story sooner and start delivering value sooner. Examples, these are, I think, copy-pasted from the chorus. So each module, I think, has a couple of these listed at the beginning. So I won't go through them here. You can have a look at them in your own time. But you see that we follow these, the same template. As a particular type of user, I want to achieve a certain goal so that I can, and then there's a reason for that. This one I mentioned already last lecture. Users shall be able to view a personal calendar and recent notifications in the system. We said then that this is not really a good requirement because there's an and in there. And if you have an and in a requirement, then that's a warning flag that maybe you actually have two requirements. We specified it as a use case as well. View calendar and notifications. The actors are the system users. And we can talk about, sorry, in the description that the user requests to view their personal calendar and the system displays the user's personal calendar, and we request to view the recent notifications and the system displays the recent notifications. There is already a shift if you look at it here. So from the first version, the classic requirement up here, we rather passively describe something that the system should provide, something that I'm supposed to be able to do, but it's a function of the system in some sense. When it comes to the use case, we are shifting and saying that this is something that the user should do against the system, and we describe a process for it. So there's a shift in focus here, but we still don't know why this is bundled up into one requirement or one use case in this case. So if we rewrite it into a user story instead and look at the reason part of the user story. So as a regular user, I want to be able to view my personal calendar and recent notifications so that I can make sure that a new notification does not double book me on an event. Okay, that is suddenly a completely different story. Now we know why it was so important to view the personal calendar and recent notifications. It's because you want to collate them against each other. And this opens up, if you're the developer, you can look at this user story and you can see there are better ways of doing this, rather than having the user trying to figure out if there's a meeting time in the notifications and is that meeting time occupied in the calendar. We can do that automatically behind the scenes and just flag when there are booking conflicts, right? So now we have an alternative solution. And then we can go to the regular user and say that the goal that you want to achieve, isn't that really that you want to be able to avoid double booking yourself? And they will probably say, yeah, I don't want to be double booked. Okay, we have this way of doing it. Would that work? Yes. And then you can start with developing a much better solution. So the rationale behind a user story, or a requirement for that matter, if you go for the classic requirements descriptions, is really important in order to figure out why do we want this. It turns out that this was actually a solution hidden in the disguise of a requirement to view the personal calendar and the notifications. It was a solution to the problem of avoiding to be double booked, but it wasn't the goal itself. We do see also here that, as I started saying, that the classic requirements up here, the top one, is simply, it's a function provided by the system. It doesn't say anything about the value involved. And as we progressed towards between use cases and user stories, we shift our focus to more and more something that will deliver a value to the customer or the user. And that is something that we should try to strive for when we do our requirements. What is actually value bringing to the customers? What will bring a value to the users? And if we're able to specify our user stories in particular, so that we are focusing on the value, that gives us the freedom to deliver that on that value much sooner and with much more flexibility in terms of what we do. User stories and use cases are not the same thing. They do focus on value, both of them, especially if you do the use case as well. But the use case is slightly more focused on the process by which a user should achieve a certain goal. The user story is just, here's the goal. The use case is, here's a process to achieve this goal. So they complement each other in some sense. But if you have the choice, or if you've already made the decision that you're going to do use cases for everything, then at least I would try to get away with just doing use cases, and probably phrasing the use cases in terms of the value they deliver. And then I would question, what is the need of doing both user stories and use cases, because they are complementary enough that I probably can get away with doing just one of them. So there's no point in doing double work. If you have a classic requirement specification, you are more, the use cases gather requirements in some sense. So you pick a subset of the requirements, all the requirements that are involved in one particular process, and you put them into the context of a use case. So there, if you have a classic requirement specification and you can't get away from that, then the use cases do add the benefit of that you get the requirements into a context, and you gather the requirements into a context such that you can then know how to continue working with them. Which requirements do you need to focus on at the same time in order to deliver something that is valuable to the customers? For example, a business process or something like that. Again, if you start from a clean slate and you don't have a hard requirement to do a classic requirement specification either, then maybe you can get away with just doing use cases. But there it's easier to at least argue how they connect to each other. If you have the classic requirement specification, then it's clear how the use cases connect that and connect the dots and gather the requirements and so on. So it's part of a process. But if you don't have a hard requirement that you must have a classic requirement specification, maybe you can take the shortcut and just do the use cases, especially if you avoid signing a contract on them. User stories. I mentioned that they're written on post-it notes, and on the back you have the acceptance criteria, or the conditions of satisfaction. Definition of done, people call it as well. That is not as clear how to fit that into a use case. You could argue that if you look at the process description, if I can follow that process description and I get that same result, then by some definition, you're done with that use case. You've done what was asked of you. There are some other means. I will get to them during this lecture, but it's not as explicit. It's something that is more a side result, if you will. That if you do a use case properly, you have these things that but you did for other reasons, so you can use them also as a definition of done. But it's not as clear as with the user story, where you explicitly have that here's the user story, and on the backside here's the definition of done. So, use cases. It is a concrete scenario. It's one work process that you describe, and it's something that it's not all possible ways of doing something. It's not all possible parts through that work description. It is one part through that work description. So if I'm buying a bottle of milk at the local supermarket, I can generalize it to saying I'm buying an item at the store. But I wouldn't go further than that. I wouldn't go further so far as to saying I'm buying an item, and this item can either be a regular item, it can be a discounted item, it can be a fixed price item, or it's a weight-based item, or it is a freebie item that you don't have to pay for, and then you have all these special cases. And if you try to do all of them at once, you're going to get bogged down into the details of figuring out how do all of these things fit together. Am I doing this complete enough now? So you focus on one thing, the most common thing. I have one item, and I'm buying that item, and I'm paying for that item, and then I'm leaving the store with that one item, or a couple of items if I want to show that there is an iteration, but not much more than that. It's one single scenario, and it's a concrete scenario. If I go deeper into the use case, I normally do that whenever I see that there is some back and forth interaction with the system. I do one thing, the system responds with something. I do another thing, and the system responds with something. You wouldn't normally not do a use case for ringing a doorbell, because it's just I press the button and there's a noise somewhere in the house. There's no interesting back and forth interaction with the system there. You would typically see that a use case contains a couple of requirements of the classic requirements, showing how they work together to solve this one scenario. You might even want to link that if you take the use case and you can add a column and saying that this is related to business requirements such and such, this is related to business requirements such and such. That way you can sort of increase the traceability between your requirement specification and your use cases. It's a positive scenario. When you're buying your liter of milk, the milk is known by the cash system or the payment system, so you don't have to enter something manually. There's no exception that this barcode doesn't scan. That works. You're paying for it, you have enough money, the cashier has enough change to give back to you. You're able to exit the store with the bottle of milk in your hand. So everything goes as expected. It's a happy path through this scenario. When you continue working with this use case, so the first iteration is this positive thing, and then when you go back and iterate this use case, then you can see that, yeah, well, we have these special cases in line 1 over here. We have these other possibilities, so we'll add them. In this line 3, 4, we have this exception, so we'll describe what will happen when that exception occurs. But in the first version of the use case, it is the positive happy path scenario. Everything goes as expected. And it's one instance of the scenario. It's not all possible cases. So here's an example of what we would call a high-level use case. You will see different names of it, but I'm going to call it a high-level use case because it's the briefest form. Actually, the briefest form of a use case is just the title. So we have a name. In this case, it's from a library system, so that the name of the use case is return book. Notice that there's both a verb and a noun there. We have an action that I want to achieve with the use case, and we have some form of item or a noun upon which I want to achieve that action. So I'm returning a book. I'm not returning my library card. I'm not returning yesterday's lunch or anything like that. It's return of the book that's relevant here. And the other way around, it is the return of the book that's important here. It's not, if I had named the use case just book, I wouldn't know what to do with it. I can return it, I can borrow it, I can throw it at the librarian, whatever. It's all, I can't guess that from the title, but with return book, I can guess what it means. So a descriptive name on the use case, that's a good starting point. And already with that, I can start working with an early prioritization. I'll know that some items are important, so just looking at the title, returning a book, is probably less important than borrowing a book in the first place, so I can prioritize according to that, just sort them. I can allocate things to different teams. So everything dealing with lending and returning books and such things might be one team member or one sub-team. Everything related to backup and or payment stuff might go to a different team. So just with the title, I can start doing work. So that's why we start with just brainstorming. What are the use cases involved in this system? Next step is that we hammer out a few details to this high-level use case. We look at who is involved in the use case, what actors are involved. In this case, it's the customer and the librarian. And what do they do? That's the description part. So what do they do? Well, a customer returns the book, the librarian scans the barcode and registers the book as being back in the library. And now we can do a bit of analysis here. So why can't the customer scan the barcode themselves? Why do we need a librarian to do that? Well, actually, the librarian also checks the condition of the book so that it's in the same condition or better than when it left the library. Okay, right. So that's why we have the librarian involved. Okay. Why is there a barcode? Why not a QR code or an RFID tag or just a picture of the front cover of the book? Well, we have barcodes on everything already, so it's an existing technology and it's cheap and we want to work with the system that we have as well. Okay, so we have a reason for that. Why does the system need to know that the book is back in the library in the first place? Why not just assume that if you can borrow it, it was in the library, and that's good enough? Well, we need to see that people don't borrow the books for too long. Okay, that's another use case then, that restricts for how long you can keep a book. So these are things that will help us understand why the use case is written as it is. And as you can guess from this, from just these three simple whys, the use case itself has already made a lot of design decisions for us, for whatever legacy reasons. And that is perhaps one of the things that differs between a use case and a user story is that in the use case, we do have these decisions all along the way, that we do take design decisions. We take decisions on how a process should work for whatever reasons. Hopefully we have reasons for it. But even if we don't have reasons, just the fact that we do this description in this way and we add stuff later on means that we are taking design decisions. One thing that I want you to ask yourself already now is, how can we test this? You can, of course, get a customer, you can get a librarian, or you can pretend to be a customer and librarian. You can return a book according to this process. And if it works, well, you've tested this use case. That doesn't scale very much, and you can't always do it like that. So you need some way of regression testing it as well. How can we build a system such that we can test this automatically over and over again? Every time we build a system, we should have a set of test cases that we're running, that we borrow a book, we return a book, and so on, according to this process, where, well, some computer program pretends to be the librarian in order to return the book in this according to this process. One more thing which is missing from a requirements engineering perspective is, whom should I talk to in order to find out more information? And that's not really a big issue. We can add an attribute to a use case saying that source, or the actors are there, so I know whom to talk to in that sense. But if I want to find exactly who said it, who wrote it down, or something like that, well, I can add that to my use case. It's your use cases. You are the ones that are supposed to be working with them. So you are free to add whatever information you see that is needed. And I just realized that I'm giving this lecture for exactly one person. That's really weird, but since they are being recorded, then I'm guessing that the rest of the class will watch them later on. So let's expand the use case then. This is what would be called a detailed use case. Sometimes you will see it called expanded use cases, and you will see all sorts of other names. Again, I'm going to call it detailed use cases. And the difference here is that I add the main course of events. And this is a table where I have on one side, I have the actors. And on the other side, I have the system response. Again, after this table, so just with the main course of events, that's my first iteration of the use case. Everything goes as expected. Next iteration, I will add even further. Then I will look at the alternative flow events. So in this table, at point P, whatever that might be, I describe what might happen instead and how should the system react to that. So all the alternative flows goes below this main course of events. So the main course of events is the concrete happy path instance of my use case process, and the alternative flows are listed below. So I've talked about this, the name of the use case, that it is at least a verb and a noun. So I can skip that. And this is also something that I talked about last lecture about prioritizing use cases. We talked about how if a use case has a direct impact on the architecture design, includes risky, time-critical, complex functions, new research and technology, primary business processes, or directly supports revenue decreased costs. These are all indications that these use cases are things that I should start working on sooner rather than later. I talked about the different prioritization techniques, so let's not dally on them. Use case diagrams then. So use case diagram is just an overview of the use cases we have. You see here that it's here we only have the titles of the use cases. So that is one of the reasons why we want to have good names on the use cases, because if we do decide to do a use case diagram, that's all we have to go by. What we see is the use cases. We see the actors involved in each use case. So the customer is involved in all of them. The Funhouse Ticket Service is involved in the top 3 use cases. Sardines Travel is involved only in the actual travel booking, and the payment is done together with Greed. So this gives us an overview of the use cases we have and the actors that are involved. And if we can see that one actor is involved in many use cases, that's perhaps something that we can discuss. That should we break up responsibilities for that actor? Are we overloading one particular actor? Or if a particular use case has many actors involved, then we can probably already now figure out that this is going to become a bottleneck. If so many people have to be involved in one particular use case, then it's going to stop up the system. So we can get an overview of these things. We also have this black square, which describes a system boundary. This means that if we are doing a bigger system consisting of several subsystems running on different machines, perhaps a front end and a back end and so on, we can provide information about that these use cases are they are available in this subsystem, and these other use cases are available in this other subsystem. So these use cases are front-end use cases, these use cases are back-end use cases, for example. So those are the things that we get here. And this also means that we could actually have use cases that are outside of any system boundaries, where we can say that these are use cases that have to be done, but they're not done by us. They're not done by any system that we're building. So that's what we're doing with use case diagrams. In my mind, at least for smaller systems, a use case diagram doesn't really add very much. If you have a text list of the use cases, the titles, and perhaps add underneath each use case title the actors involved, categorize them according to the system or subsystems that you have, you probably have the same overview. So I wouldn't spend time doing a diagram of this until I have a large enough set of use cases that it becomes a problem to get this overview. But at least you now know how to read a use case diagram, even if you might not do them yourself. There are 2 ways of relating use cases to each other. we have extend, and we have include. So for example, if I'm doing an ATM, a bank terminal, as a customer, I can examine what I've got in my accounts, and I can withdraw money from my accounts. Both of these require me to authenticate myself. So I could repeat that in each use case, the entire authentication process, or I can make a separate use case of those, saying that this is the process for authenticating myself against the bank. And then I can use the include relationship, saying that I'm including the authentication at a particular step of these examine account and withdraw money use cases. This is a second or maybe even a third step. Your first job is to figure out what the customer wants. And the customer, delivering value to the customer is, I want the ability to examine an account and I want the ability to withdraw money. And the bank will say that, well, I want people to authorize themselves so that I know which account to display information about, or that I withdraw money from the right account. That's fine. Now you have the use cases, and it's just the next step after that, where you say that, well, we're actually using them, we're including them and everything. But very first, just get their use cases down. Which use cases do you have? Which customers or which actors do you have? Which subsystems and systems do you have? And then you can move on to relating them to each other. Right, withdraw money. Another use case. Here's a more full example of this. We have the title of the use case, we have the primary actor, and we have other actors involved. That's something that we can now do. We can list that we have primary actors. Those are the ones that are doing most of the work in the use case, if you will. But there are other actors involved that has to be checked with for different parts of this process. The description, again, a brief process description. We authenticate ourselves against the bank, select how much money we want to withdraw, and in what type of banknotes. The system update the account and give us money, and then we're done. Main flow events, then we have this table. Point 1, we authorize ourselves to the machine, and this is how we do the include in the use case text. We initiate the use case authorization, and authorization is underlined, showing that, yeah, that's another use case. This is a happy path, which means that we are able to authenticate ourselves, which means that we can immediately move on to item 3, where we check how much money is available. System displays this. We decide how much money we want and in what banknotes we want it. System checks that you actually have that much money on the account, subtracts that from my account, and gives me the money. And then I get my card back. A few things to note here is that with step 5 and 6, you see that every action that the actor takes doesn't necessarily have to give a response from the system. I might do several things just in the user interface, and then I send that off as one request to the system, which is what's happening here. I want so and so many rupees, crowns, whatever, and I want them in these and these denominations. There's no point in the system doing anything in there between, so it's just waiting until you've told the system, I want it in 500 rupee notes, whatever. Then the system can go and check that you have that much money, and so on. If we dive a bit deeper into this use case, we'll throw in a few more things. The first thing we throw in is this list of alternative flows. Step 2, up here, if we fail to authorize ourselves, well, what happens then? Well, the transaction is aborted. Step 7, when we check that there's enough funds in the account, well, there isn't. So we abort the transaction and we show an error message. Step 9, we don't have, or the ATM doesn't have the banknotes that you requested, so we get other banknotes instead. Step 9, again, there's not enough money in the ATM. So we abort the transaction and we initiate a different use case saying that, well, we're out of money. Okay. So this is when we start dealing with the alternative ways in which the system can react. I've also added 2 sections up here, preconditions and postconditions. So preconditions, those are things that have to be true for the use case to start in the first place. So first of all, I need to be a customer at the bank. Otherwise, I can't use their ATM. I can't use my petrol card or my library card and try to get money on that. If I do, the system won't even get started with this use case. It'll jump directly to, well, this is an invalid card. There is money in the bank terminal. If the bank terminal has already decided that, yeah, I don't have enough funds to honor your request, it'll show a warning message and it won't accept you to withdraw money in the first place there. It'll say that, well, there's no money here, you can check your account, but you can't get any money out of me. So in order to run this use case, these preconditions must be true. The postconditions are the things that have to be true once the use case is successfully completed. So if everything works as it should, the customer will have the money and be able to walk away with the money, and the available funds on the customer's account will be updated accordingly. So if I've withdrawn 500 rupees, my account should show that I have 500 rupees less. If something goes wrong, if I'm able to walk away with money in my hand and my account isn't updated, well, that's a bug. That means that the bank is losing money. If my account is updated but I'm not getting any money, well, that's also a bug, because then the bank is stealing my money. So these post conditions are the things that if everything goes as expected, this should be true. Here you actually have your definition of done, if you will, your acceptance criteria. Part of the test, the regression test that you could do for this. So you can run this process and you can check these post conditions, and if the post conditions are true, well, the process completed successfully. So that's a way to recognize that your test conditions here in the post, or specify your test conditions. Right. I've only got a few more things to say, so I'll plow on, and then I'll finish early instead today, if that's okay. So I've talked about includes in the use cases. With an include, what I do is I borrow this entire other use case and I put that into the flow of the current use case, and then I continue with whatever I'm doing. So I can use my include relationship to compose a larger use case with the help of several smaller ones. So in my buy item at the supermarket example, when I'm paying, I can pay by cash, I can pay by card, I can pay by check, for example. So when it comes to, in the use case, I'm buying an item, it's the barcode on it is scanned, the sale is updated, and so on. And when it comes to payment, I select I want to pay by card. Okay, and then we initiate this other use case. We include this other use case as a whole. And once I'm paid by card successfully, my transaction is updated and I can leave the store with my bottle of milk happily. So that's include. And I think what happened was that when they defined how to specify use cases, they looked at, well, include is one way of doing it. So both include and extend, they're inheritance in some sense. And if we have include like this, well, sometimes we want to be able to do extend as well, because it's inheritance, right? And so we use inheritance to extend things. So with extend, what we're saying is that the use case, the new use case, is the same as the old, except for the modifications that we introduce. So if we want to say, for example, let's move this out of the way. Yeah. There's a new way of paying. I can pay with a gift certificate. Well, that's like paying by cash, but with a few exceptions. There are a few differences there. So what we'll do is that we'll reuse as much as we can from the pay by cash use case and just specify what the differences are to this. So we will specify that what happened, when are we rerouting, if you will, to this new use case? Well, we specify trigger. At what point should we do the extension rather than the original use case? Well, we've selected pay by cash and we want actually to pay with a gift certificate. Okay. The extension points, where can this happen? Well, if we want to do payments, that's when we can select gift certificate instead. And then the main course of events, we just detail the changes to the flow. So when I read this, and when I read what the course book has written about the extend relationship, I'm not sure that even Craig Larman knows why it's there. He's writing something fluffy, hoping that someone else will be able to find a good meaning for it, good use for it. I think that the cases where you want to do an extend relationship is probably very rare. I haven't seen them in reality, at least. I would suggest that you avoid using extends relationship unless you're absolutely certain that this is the absolute best reason or best way to do this particular use case is to extend something else. Then sure, but we don't have to stick to the mathematical modeling definitions that we should only specify one thing once and we should reuse that. This is not a database. We don't have to adhere to Boyce Codd normal forms or anything like that. We can repeat ourselves in the use case. If we think that pay by a gift certificate is a good idea, well, sure, copy the pay by cash and rewrite it to pay by gift certificate. The process shouldn't be that long and complicated that that we are saving some time by allowing just or specifying just the differences. We'll put in a relation, a related field instead. We'll put in an attribute saying that, well, this should follow the pay by cash use case, and if that changes, remember to update here as well. That should take care of most reasons for wanting to use the extends relationship. So just to illustrate once more the difference between extend and include. So if I want to make pancakes, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but I was hungry when I made a slide, so I'm now going to make you hungry as well. So if I want to make pancakes, the batter for pancakes is flour, salt, milk, and eggs. And that's fine. I can do pancakes and I can do them standalone. I don't have to think about doing anything else in order to do pancakes. And sometimes I want to make waffles instead. Now, making a batter for waffles is exactly like doing pancakes, but I add some more butter to the batter. I don't have to change anything in the process for doing pancakes. All I have to do is make the batter for pancakes and then add butter. Then I can do waffles as well. If I want to make bread, well, a bread dough is sort of like a pancake batter, but there are some subtle differences. So I'll start by doing the bread, and I'll add some yeast. And when it's time to add flour, and now I'm extending the pancakes and saying it's like doing pancakes, but I'm going to add more flour. When they say add flour, I'm saying add more flour. Add salt, well, there's no change there. I need salt in my bread as well. And when the pancake batter says add milk, I say, well, I could actually use water here instead if I'm doing bread. So I'll specify that. And when the pancake use case says, well, add eggs, I don't want eggs in my bread, so I'll skip that, and then I'm done. So in this way, I can reuse the things that are common, and I just specify that in this step I'm doing things differently. In that step I'm doing things differently, and this and that step I'm not doing it all. So I think this probably more than anything, this drives home the point that if I think I need to do extents, I probably can get as much clarity if I just do them as two separate use cases. Making bread is not making pancakes, and then I'm done. The include relationship is more useful because then I can compose larger processes built up by smaller processes. That actually was my last slide. So let's take a leg stretcher until a quarter past, and then we'll have a discussion after this. So I'm pausing the recording now.